Hello everyone, and today it is time for me to recap/review on the retrospective season of Big Brother 6. And this season definitely had some changes, especially with the house and the graphics, where it seems a lot less retro-based and a lot more game-centric and a lot more fun with how they edited the show and how they used the graphics and the sound effects. Though when it comes to the actual format of the show and the game, it is the exact same as Big Brother 5, as they utilize the double eviction even more, the 14-player cast, and we have more casting twists in general. Interestingly enough, while this season is the most popular now of the older seasons, or at least compared to BB5 and BB4, this season had a huge drop in ratings compared to all the other seasons, and it wasn't seen as very popular on a rating standpoint. Overall, I definitely do like the season, as it is a huge mix of drama, two sides just going at it, and a lot of funny moments. Though strategically, it is definitely one of the weaker seasons, but overall, it's just a real joy to watch, and you can tell that most of the cast contributed overall. Despite everything I said about the season being a good one, week 1 is the most boring, uneventful week of the season, and it's honestly one of the worst week 1s ever. It might be one of the more boring weeks in Big Brother history, where it is easy for you to forget everything that ended up happening. So Jennifer mentions being the total package, Michael makes a poor painting pun, Yvette mentions that her secret is being gay, and Howie mentions something involving some poor forecasting weather pun. Janelle has all the tips for winning, Rachel is going to gallop through the competition, Bo is going to add style to the competition, Sarah won't be the nice girl that finishes last, and Maggie makes some poor nursing pun. James mentions nothing getting past him, April is a cutthroat competitor, Ashleigh is going to use everything to win, and Eric makes the same intro puns Jace did last season about being a firefighter. Kaysar refuses to bow down to attention when he's at a mosque. Jules tells us about the pairs twist and how everyone thinks they are the only pairs in the house when everyone really has a pair. I noticed that in these older intro packages, we really don't get much information, especially in the BB4 to BB6 ones, and even in the future seasons, since they're based on casting twists and they hide certain information. So we don't get much into their backstories and their strategies entering the house. So Janelle and Eric end up arguing about the sleeping arrangement, as she wants to take a sleeping bag for her bed, but there's only 14 beds, and a few of them are sleeping bags, so it's inconsiderate for her. And it's immediately clear that Michael and Kaysar are a pair. For the first time in modern Big Brother, we don't have an awkward scene of everyone talking about who the gay guy is, and he has to struggle with revealing it. Some people talk about Janelle's look, Howie mentions that Jennifer is standoffish, James thinks that Howie has some sort of issues, and James lies about his job. After the food competition, it is clear that the two teams start strategizing, and the orange team, which consists of James, Janelle, April, Sarah, Howie, Maggie, and Rachel, agree that not only should they throw it to one person, but they should stick together for the first 2 to 3 weeks. Eric mentions to Bo and Michael that because they're in a gender disadvantage, where there's 6 men against 8 women, they're going to pick the men off, so he wants them to stick together. It is clear with Howie and Rachel being the final 2 in the competition and how they speak to one another, it's clear that they are also a pair. Rachel ends up winning HOH. We have a segment about Kaysar praying and people getting over their biases due to the war of Iraq currently going on, and Kaysar is of Iraqi descent. It's interesting how they edit him compared to other Middle Eastern men on Big Brother, which I've talked about in a video in the past. Jennifer talks about how hot a lot of the guys are and is trying to flirt massively, but James sees right through it and right through her. Rachel wants the Alliance of 7 to give their opinions on her based on who to nominate. We have Kaysar and Eric talk about forming an alliance and working with James and Michael, since he, Eric, considers Bo to be one of the girls, and Howie is just a no. Maggie sees Rachel as her biggest threat, and James pitches Jennifer to Rachel, where Rachel is considering that name as well. Rachel nominates Ashleigh and Kaysar for eviction, though we literally get no reason or indication beforehand as to why this is the case. We are then told that Ashleigh is nominated because she didn't speak to Rachel. So many first boots in BB Can and BB US have made this mistake, in the seasons that I've covered and the seasons that I will cover in the future, and it's just a really dumb move. Kaysar also didn't really speak to Rachel, but thought that him being nice was enough, and he didn't really speak to many people in general. Bo mentions that he is close with Kaysar on an intellectual level and prefers him over the other guys, and we know that this won't last long, but Bo tells Kaysar that he's too much of an introvert. We have a segment about Howie and his math/actions, which makes some laugh, but a bunch of people are creeped out by it. We have the TV screen, and I don't know why it's shocking since they had one last season, but it causes Rachel to find the secret room, which is cool enough as a scene. Eric speaks about being a firefighter, the brotherhood within it, and how he was meant to be a fighter, which causes Yvette to fall in awe with Eric, and we learn that he and Yvette are also aligned with one another. Yvette tells Eric that he needs to trust Bo, and he doesn't. I have my reasons for this, but it's clear that Yvette knows Bo during this conversation. She mentions that she wants Ashlia, Janelle, Jennifer, and Maggie gone, and it's interesting she mentioned all women, so it seemed like she wanted to work with the guys at first. And his demeanor changes when Maggie is brought up. Way too much time is wasted on the secret room, but Eric and Maggie notice how calculating Rachel was with doing the clue on her own and then presenting it to everyone at once. So it seems like people are starting to see through Rachel here, and it's an interesting point to notice for later. A few of the others mentioned that Ashlia has a poor social game and keeps to herself. Rachel ends up winning the veto and is in agreement beforehand with her and Maggie that she would win it, and there's some talk about her backdoing Jennifer as she went into Rachel's HOH washroom and locked the HOH door without her permission, though Jennifer unlocked it when she left, but nothing comes from it as Rachel doesn't use the veto. Ashlia talks to Janelle and Howie about needing votes, and we see Janelle campaign to April for Ashlia. Eric, and to a lesser extent James, is bothered that Michael and Jennifer are getting too close. Kaysar asks Eric if he should tell him to stay away from Jennifer, but Eric, April's present too, tells him not to say anything. Of course, Kaysar ends up telling Michael, and he doesn't want Michael to say anything. Of course, Michael decides to tell Eric that there's nothing going on with himself and Jennifer. This causes Eric to be pissed off, since obviously Kaysar told Michael, and Kaysar is annoyed that Michael told him. Now, Eric doesn't trust either Michael or Kaysar, and it's clear Eric is creating his own problems. Apparently, from what we would see next week, a lot of that drama started in this week, and Eric didn't like Michael and Jennifer's relationship. But the whole thing with Michael being a P-word, or predator, wouldn't be due to what we saw next week, but what would happen here with himself and Jennifer. But according to what I read, it was a misunderstanding, and it wasn't what it appeared to be on the show. But I can't say for sure since I didn't watch it, and I wasn't watching feeds at the time, and it's really hard to archive certain information. So the pairs are revealed to us. Bo and Yvette are former co-workers, Michael and Kaysar are neighbors, Maggie and Eric are friends, and we see Michael and Kaysar and Eric and Maggie figuring out some of the pairs. James and Sarah are dating, April and Jennifer are sorority sisters, though this is a bunch of BS really, and they figure out some of the other pairs as well. Janelle and Ashlia are ex-roommates, and Rachel and Howie are friends. Everyone pretty much figures out the pairs immediately, and Janelle complains that after Ashlia leaves, it will be the young, cute girls against the older ladies, the Latin chick, and the gay guy. How lovely she put that all together. We have a segment about James and Sarah dating, but acting like they are single. Ashlia is evicted in a 9-2 vote. There's no way around it, but Ashlia is arguably the sole dud in the season. She really wasn't playing the game at all, and we kept on hearing people mention how she was annoying, vain, and all that stuff, but we never got any of that or saw any of that. So I don't know if she was just misunderstood or whatever, but ultimately she was the best first boot if I had to pick anyone, since she just wasn't offering anything, and I don't think she had any potential to be an interesting character or a strong player. Week 2 is where the season definitely starts to kick off with a lot of the drama and the backstabbing, and you start to see the sides really start to solidify and form here. So Howie starts being a creep by repeatedly hugging Janelle, which is ironic since what will happen this week, and Eric ends up winning HOH, with Bo and Yvette running into his arms. Janelle and Kaysar are not excited about Eric winning HOH, and there's discussion about who the other vote to evict Kaysar was, but we learn that Eric and James planned that the latter would throw a hinky vote, but is pushing that Michael did the vote, because Eric doesn't trust him anymore. Maggie hugs Eric in the HOH room, which she immediately regrets, and James thinks it's odd that she hugged him. Yvette makes a ghetto slide out of garbage bags because there's nothing else to do in the house, and Janelle calls it ghetto. We get a segment of Michael kissing April and Yvette's legs a few times, and she, as well as Yvette, told him to stop, but he ignores them, questioning if they think he is being disrespectful. April tells Eric, who tells Michael that the women are feeling uncomfortable and he's giving him a heads up, which I do appreciate. Michael complains to Jennifer, since Eric made it seem like he's a creep and predator, essentially, and it seems like she agrees that it is a double standard. Eric enters the room and they talk about it once again, where Eric mentions that what he did could be considered sexual assault and they wouldn't understand it as guys, but Michael doesn't understand why people aren't telling him this directly. Michael mentions that he isn't an employee of Eric's and isn't getting it. Apparently, some mentioned that Eric used certain words to other house guests to manipulate the entire situation, as he wanted a reason to turn against Michael. This is what I got from people who watched the feed at the time and some of the comments I was reading in the archives, since Eric found other alliances. It is interesting since later in the season, people would consistently mention that this was something that was twisted, and by people, I mean the house guests would mention this. But there's some nuances and so many nuances to the situation that I could spend an hour on, but I just don't really have the time. And the actual situation that the house guests repeatedly mentioned on the episodes wasn't even what we were shown, but it involved Jennifer. Though some mentioned that she actually liked the intention from Michael, but got jealous that he hooked up with Janelle. I don't know, but that's what I read. Eric and James end up arguing about politics, especially about the Iraqi war, where James thinks it is justified and Eric thinks that it isn't justified. But Kesar is pissed off at James's rationale, but they end up clearing the air, since Kesar has relatives whose bare necessities can't be met due to the war in Iraq. We have one of the few segments in Janelle's entire BB history where it's painted like she's manipulating the guys by pretending to be too dumb to play chess against them. Eric ends up attempting to cheer everyone up after the half-knot loss, but it comes off as mansplaining as well to some, and tries to manage everyone's food, which is a sign that he's a control freak. We learn about Michael and Janelle's blossoming showmans, and Eric is planning on putting Michael and Janelle up, since people are thinking that they are a showman, and putting them up will disprove it, or at least that's what he's telling Michael. He will tell Michael that he is a pawn, but he is really the target. Sarah is told about this plan and mentions to Maggie that she can't believe Eric is being deceitful, which Maggie tells Eric about, and it's clear that they have Sarah and James on their radar, since she's a hypocrite, since it's clear that those two are a pair, and he claims James is manipulating everyone in the house. He would mention later that James thinks he and Eric are aligned, so it shows that Eric didn't really think that same way about James. Eric has one-on-one conversations with everyone in the house and mentions to Michael that the guys' alliance is done. Eric nominates Janelle and Michael for eviction. Eric mentions that he distrusted Michael because of who he was hanging out with, and he knew Janelle wanted him out, and April says that she has Janelle's back, where Kesar and Michael are pissed off. Yvette, Maggie, and April and other people give Eric props, where the nominees go in the golden room to rant about Eric. He tells Kesar that Michael has intimidated the woman in the house, and that Kesar is a liability because Michael doesn't socialize with people and stays in the golden room. Michael ends up telling Bo about the guys' alliance, and Bo tells Eric, where the latter mentions that body language means more than words. Though he could have just clarified things, but he never really cared to, and it seemed like he was just coming up with any sort of excuse, instead of just playing both sides, which is what he should have done, but this is Eric we're talking about. April warns Janelle about Michael making people uncomfortable, where Janelle mentions that Eric is manipulating everyone, but thinks that April is full of crap and is trying to work her. April tells her to distance herself from Michael, and we see a bunch of little confrontations between Michael and Eric, where the latter is mad that Michael is looking at him, and Maggie is over their BS. Michael is thinking about taking Kesar to play in the Vita for him, where he mentions that Kesar is a target nonetheless, which he is right about, but Kesar doesn't want to stick his neck out from Michael, which would be a theme with Kesar, especially in the next season. Who tells Kesar that his key was placed last for a reason. That's what Michael told him. Kesar tells Michael that it doesn't matter if they used semantics or not regarding the situation, and Michael is still really upset about being called an XUL predator and doesn't understand why it is happening. Michael isn't taking it well at all, as he's lashing out in front of everyone about how people think he's a predator and a molester because the midget Eric and the ghetto Yvette, the amount of times they call Yvette ghetto this season is kind of disturbing, told people that because of his actions with Jennifer, but we don't know what his actions with Jennifer are. It's never really explained here, and it shows that they were talking about something that wasn't even shown on the episodes. So they kind of tried to make this narrative come off as what was shown in the last episode, but that wasn't it. We see a conversation with Eric really pinning it down to April about how Michael would be arrested in the real world and is a sexual harasser. Michael and Janelle were talking crap about Eric, and Rachel overhears the conversation where she mentions that they were talking about him. Eric mentions that he was told that they said something about his family, which they didn't, and Michael burps when he is passing Yvette, which is rude, and they mention something about their mother should be proud to one another. Yvette wants to go off and Cuban on Michael, and Eric is also pissed off where they want to go at Michael. After lecturing Michael, Kesar speaks to Yvette and Eric about what happened, since he genuinely is curious about what happened since he doesn't know, and Eric mentions that Michael said something about his family, though he refuses to say what, because Eric doesn't even know what was said, because nothing was said. And Yvette rambles about her lack of relationship with Kesar throughout the season. Michael comes outside, and Eric rambles about how Michael talks about his family, which Michael denies, but calls him a midget with a small penis. Eric tries to get in his face, and they're separated by the house. Kesar and Yvette continue the conversation, and she apparently calls him a sand bleep 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 bleep, which is the N-word, which causes Kesar to stand up in an intimidating manner. The four of them are separated, a house meeting happens, and the four of them seemingly clear the air. James ends up winning the veto and decides to not use the veto. Michael and Eric have another conversation about keeping things civil, and Eric talks to Rachel about how Michael isn't as bad of a person, and she mentions that Michael isn't a threat, where they discuss Janelle being more threatening. He mentions this to April, Yvette, and Maggie, as she is better in competitions. James mentions that Michael going is better for the sanity of the house, but a bad move strategically. But Janelle has Kesar and Michael at the palm of her hands, which will be the start of the manipulating man narrative that would follow Janelle throughout the season. Howie ends up telling Janelle about what people are speaking about her, but he also mentions that the people who are in the winning group in the first HOH comp will keep her, which should be enough votes. Michael and Janelle isolate themselves from the house, and they end up spending most of their time together where their feelings for one another grows, and they end up having a Spider-Man kiss. Janelle was dating someone from New York when she entered the house, and ended up breaking up with him on TV for Michael. Michael is evicted in a 9-1 vote. Michael himself wasn't very interesting, and I do think he should have handled the women in the house better, where once the women say no, it should be no. And he really didn't handle the conversation with Eric well, and he really got emotional and started lashing out about it in an uncomfortable manner. As a player, I don't think he did a whole lot wrong, but I don't think he was a good player, since he was extremely emotional, he couldn't manage his alliances, and he made the house guests feel extremely uncomfortable. At the same time, he wasn't going to offer more to the house than what he offered in his short time in the house. So, yeah. So week 3 is definitely one of the stronger weeks of the season, as the sides are officially formed in this week, and we have a huge blindside that happens, not at the eviction ceremony, not even at the veto ceremony, but at the veto competition, and watching all the pieces come together was just really great to see. So April tries cheering Janelle up, who is sad because both Michael and Ashley are gone, and April mentions that she could hang out with her. April mentions in the diary room that she likes and dislikes Janelle. Kesar ends up winning the HOH, and most of the house is pissed off, but Janelle, Rachel, and Howie are really happy. It's kind of interesting seeing how Rachel and Howie are kind of playing both sides, or at least they had bonds with both sides at this point, which was smart for them. Yvette is extremely nervous and is hoping that they can get Janelle on the block, in addition to thinking that she will be nominated, though Janelle mentions that they aren't worried about Yvette. Maggie thinks that she is safe, and April thinks herself and Jennifer will be nominated. James enters the room to see the three of them talking and mentions to Eric that Howie is with Kesar and Janelle, where he's been kissing their butts for the last 3 days, which is interesting. Howie pushes for Kesar to target James. Janelle and Kesar talk about how they lost their partners and how it's clear that James and Sarah are a couple. He mentions that if he can work with James, he'll keep him safe, but will send James home otherwise. Kesar speaks to James in the HOH room, and the latter mentions that his partner was supposed to be a guy, but he backed out, which is definitely true, and that's why there's a gender imbalance in this season in favor of the woman because they had Sarah replace James's initial partner. Kaysar lists to James all the pairs in the house and how he and Janelle lost their partners, but James still denies it, despite Kaysar telling him that he wants to work with him. Yvette ends up having a conversation with April, and she is sad because there's nothing else to talk about. And she tells April that she has a girlfriend instead of a boyfriend, where she kept it from the house but Bo. And it's interesting that she told April this, since we know how things will go between them as the season goes on. And I thought we wouldn't get this content in earlier seasons, or like in the earlier 4 seasons, but I guess I was wrong. But it was more somber here, and sweet here. Kaysar wants to put up Maggie and James, since it will cause Eric to choose a side, and Kaysar says the entire house is dumb, which will be a thing with him in Big Brother in general. And then we get a scene of Howie ogling Rachel, which is just really annoying. We also learn that instead of a religion, Howie is a Jedi, I guess. I guess we'll get more of this content in his final week in the house. Yvette doesn't apologize, but mentions that there was a part of her that did like Kaysar for the first few days. She throws Janelle under the bus and mentions that she would have sold him under the river and suggests herself as a pawn against Janelle, which would give him some goodwill, and I honestly think this is a bad move for Yvette. Sarah mentions that she has no allies and doesn't really trust anyone, but she denied earlier that she and James are together, and she admits it this time. Kaysar tells her that people told him to put Sarah and James up, and she tells James that James thinks that Kaysar is trying to turn him against his people, and tells him that no one but Janelle wants him here, which is kinda true, but he will be safe if Janelle is nominated. Kaysar ends up nominating James and Maggie for eviction. Maggie is genuinely shocked that she is nominated, and James is annoyed because Kaysar told him that he is safe. Yvette ends up crying and is told by James that she will be backdoored, since Eric is safe due to their promise from when Eric was HOH. Kaysar wanted to expose the alliances and duels, and Eric goes to speak to him that he swears on his children that he won't change the nominations if he is chosen for the veto, and if he wins it. Maggie is annoyed that Eric made the agreement, but she won't hold it against him. Sarah tells Kaysar that James is really mad, but Kaysar doesn't want James to go. James speaks to Kaysar and mentions that Eric spoke to him, which pisses James off, since he tells Kaysar that Eric will veto Maggie, and James is told that he'll be voted out if the nominations remain. James realizes that Eric is a liar and a backstabber, and suggests for Kaysar to put up Eric, since he's made and broke several promises to people in the house, which is true. Sarah lies to Janelle about knowing James because she didn't speak to him yet, and she tells him that Janelle and Co still do not trust them, which causes for the both of them to finally reveal that they are dating to Kaysar and Janelle, since James realizes that he needs to win and get them on his side or he will go home. What would become the Sovereign Six is formed since he mentions that Howie and Rachel are together, and so are James and Sarah, where they will be the final 6. Kaysar tells Rachel that if James is vetoed off, they will put up Eric and their 5 votes will send him home, but James is told otherwise, and he tells Howie this as well. Kaysar tells Maggie that she is not the target and she wants James gone, but doesn't buy it, since he would have told her that beforehand, and she doesn't believe in pawns, whereas she could still go home. People are shocked that James picked Janelle for the veto, and it showed to them that he flipped. The competition is done in a way where people in the minority cannot win the comp, and it reminds me of those early jury BB4 comps. And Maggie and Yvette are immediately ganged up on. They help James win the veto, and Maggie is stunned. She confronts Kaysar, who mentions that he was made an outcast for the first few weeks, and she mentions that he sealed her fate, but he replies that he sealed her partner's fate. And Maggie just goes, amazing. Amazing. Eric mentions that Kaysar threw the competition and speaks to him, where it's confirmed to him that Kaysar threw it and Eric is going up. He throws the Quran in Kaysar's face and takes the hat that he gave James off James's head. He argues with James for a bit and mentions to Sarah that it's clear that she is in a relationship with James. Yvette and Jennifer are pissed off at him and mentions that Eric owed him for not using the veto last week. That's what James told them. Yvette regrets getting rid of Ashleigh over Kaysar, which was done because she was annoying. James uses the veto on himself, and Eric is named the replacement nominee. Eric tells his allies to not get worked up, and he pretty much tells Sarah to go away, hoping that Kaysar is able to live with his choice. It's clear that they showed footage from the veto competition, or the day of the veto competition, where Yvette, Eric, and Maggie rant about how 3 people, which are Janelle, Kaysar, and James, were able to flip things around over a group of 9. We also see that Maggie and Eric tell one another to calm down, and that whoever stays needs to wreak havoc. The Softs mention that they want Maggie to go because she is smarter and doesn't lay her cards out, where we see Maggie tell Eric that he's going to stay and she would rather sacrifice herself over him. All of that footage was from the day of the comp, but they're showing it in the eviction episode, probably because there was nothing really happening after the veto ceremony up until the eviction. Apparently, they all start revealing the truth, and it comes out that James lied about Sarah, his career, and his age, which many people pick up on. Eric and Maggie confirm that they are a pair. Janelle and Kesa confirm that the partners were booted. Howie and Rachel confirm that they are partners. Yvette and Beau, as well as April and Jennifer, did not confirm that they knew one another, though everyone knows that they are full of crap. April and Jennifer finally admit that they do know one another, but they only met once or twice, which is true, and apparently it was because they were trying to get cast on some sorority show. And Yvette also confirms half of the story about herself and Beau, where Eric realizes that Yvette is also gay. Eric is evicted in a 5-4 vote. Eric really wasn't a likable person in the house, and while he did have his moments, especially with how he spoke to Michael initially, he kind of used that situation to try to get out of his deals and played a lot of semantics, and he was just a really huge control freak. And I think if he just calmed down, he would have done better, since he did have a decent social relationship with a lot of people in the house, and he was able to get into alliances. Overall, I definitely think the season would have been worse had he stayed longer, but he makes for a fine enough pre-jury villain who had a rise and a quick fall. So I find week 4 to be one of the more boring weeks of the season in general, and not a whole lot stands out about it. Half of the house is really sad, and the other half is really happy about Eric's departure. Maggie ends up winning the HOH, which quickly causes them to turn their frowns upside down. Maggie mentions that she is going to make it strategic and personal. Sarah is sad that she blew the HOH competition, and James tries his best to cheer her up, but it's clear that he is in danger. Kesa also knows that he is in deep danger, though Harry mentions to him that the couples might be targeted due to Julie revealing the prize money, which is $1 million, I believe. Yvette and Maggie speak in the storage room and mentions that they're going to go with the plan that Eric presented to them before he left. Maggie speaks to Rachel in the HOH room and tells her that Eric really liked her before he left, and so did Maggie, but she's a complete gray to her. It's interesting since Beau would also mention this to Rachel weeks later. Maggie brings Howie in the HOH room and mentions that she was told that it was his idea to put her up, and the flashback confirms that it is true. Maggie noticed that Howie would always look to Rachel for approval about what to say, and they make a deal to not nominate one another. James talks to Yvette, Maggie, and Beau about why he flipped, and they're really pissed off at him, since his side was just as messy as well. Sames and Janelle are annoyed that James is speaking to them and mentions that it will make him a bigger target. They want to let him back in the group, and James mentions that Eric showed that he was expendable and would do the same to Yvette and Beau. James speaks to Maggie in the HOH room and apologizes to her, but she ignores it, and James mentions that he would do better without Sarah, since he knows that couples are going to be targeted. He mentions that he cannot read her, and Maggie gives him nothing to work with, where he notices how she set up the room as a perfect interrogation room, causing him to think of her as a cop. We have a segment about Howie loving the breasts of women in the BB house, which we don't need this content. The Softs think that James and Kesa will be put up, with Janelle as the replacement nominee, but they think James is their target. We get a segment about Yvette creating a bunch of compartments, activities, and different types of foods, even making the PB&J diet fun for the house guests, which I think is a good social maneuver. We see Beau and Howie kiss, and they start to randomly flirt with one another. Sarah ends up speaking to the other side of the house and tells them that herself and James are on the out of that alliance, and mentions that she and James will go to bed, but the other four would go to bed an hour or two later, and also mentions that Howie is a lot smarter. He appears. Beau mentions that Sarah is not a strong player since she spills everything, and Maggie knows that Sarah came up with an agenda to make James look good. And Janelle will cling to Howie if Kesa is evicted, which is definitely true, but Maggie wants to get rid of people where there will be the least blowback/resistance on. Maggie nominates James and Kesa for eviction. Yvette reveals that Eric discussed the plans with them before he left, and Kesa thinks that the house doesn't think for themselves. Sarah ends up crying because she pulled the last key and thought that it would be James's because she saw J.A., but it was Janelle's key. Kesar refuses to campaign against James, and they both think that her nominations were solely personal, since she didn't nominate a pair, and they have to choose their pair, and Janelle is Kesar's, since Howie and Rachel wouldn't use the veto if they won, since one of them could be nominated as a replacement. James doesn't think that Sarah is a good competitor, so he's essentially fighting for himself. Yvette cries because it hit her that good guy Eric is gone, and that the 3 bad people are still in the house, and this good guy stuff is really annoying to me. But anyways, James goes to comfort her and mentions that he does genuinely like Yvette and is playing both sides, which he says he's been doing since the beginning. He has a conversation with Kesar and Janelle about how Maggie pulled psychological warfare with the keys, and they mention that if Kesar comes off the block, Sarah will be used as the pawn, and the Softs want to vote her out since she's the weakest link in the alliance. James mentions that they need to find a way to get Sarah to win the veto so they can both be safe, and he mentions that he wants her to seem expendable so she won't be used to hurt him, but I honestly think it's just James doing what James does. James also pulls Yvette aside to promise on the Bible that he will target Howie and Rachel, and he threw their names out because they are under the radar, and is doing this to help regain trust with the friendship, but it's just another sloppy move by James. Anyways, James ends up giving Sarah the veto win, which means that the both of them are safe. Maggie is thinking about who to put up, and James is pretty sad that Kesar is going to go home, despite him being safe. Yvette pitches to her alliance that they need to get rid of Janelle, where April mentions that they all need to make decisions as a team, where Maggie tells them to not let any of the others know about who she's putting up and to make them all feel unsafe. Yvette speaks to James about if he's still willing to put up Howie and Rachel, and he outright admits that he has to go after Maggie, since she turned Sarah's TV off in the veto competition. Yvette walks off since James is playing dirty and making stupid moves. I agree, and this was ridiculously sloppy and unnecessary, and he won't take any accountability for why he will be put in a position that he will very soon face himself in. In general, there really isn't a lot going on in this week, and it starts to drag. Kesar speaks to his alliance, and he mentions that he's going to speak to Maggie, and to make a proposition that if he puts up someone from her end, which is Jennifer, because she's the weakest link, then they wouldn't target her. This is such a weak proposal, and there's no incentive of Maggie to do this. But anyways, when he does this, Maggie literally doesn't say anything, which is a huge sign. And when James vetoes James, Janelle is nominated as the replacement. Maggie mentions that if the Softs voted to boot Janelle, and they all boot Kesar, it would show her that she's expendable. So essentially what the Softs did to Maggie last week when they, meaning her own alliance, voted her out. April has a conversation with Kesar and mentions that someone from his side went to someone from her side and said that they would nominate Howie and Rachel. Kesar ends up telling Howie and Rachel, and Maggie has a conversation with Kesar that she is aware that he was told, and that the two sides need to put their issues aside to target James. Despite all of that, Yvette thinks that it's dumb to even think about keeping Kesar, since it will be the two heads of the snake, meaning James and Kesar, who will work together again when they have the opportunity to do so. Now Janelle has been told about what James did and thinks that she might be a gunner, since she's seen as the weaker player. We have the friendship talking about their loss of Eric, and the Softs making fun of them for it. James tells them that Maggie needs to be gone since she has manifested into Eric and took his position as a leader. But Kesar doesn't think that she's much of a threat. Kesar is evicted in a 7-1 vote. Kesar is definitely a likable person in the season, and I really like how he wanted to play the game hard and to make big moves. At the same time, I definitely started seeing a lot of his faults in the game, even from the outright beginning, where he wasn't doing well socially and was kind of keeping to himself. And now that we know that he has autism, which he spoke about in the second All-Stars, it actually makes a lot of sense. In general, he was never going to last long in the season, and I would think of him higher as a player if he didn't come back in the season. Week 5 is definitely one of the better weeks in the season, and a lot of juiciness happens here, but it also starts the derailment of an alliance and permanently changed the direction of the season. So Howie ends up winning HOH, though Rachel threw it, and James feels like he is safe. The friendship is worried, especially since Rachel took out April in the competition, and Yvette is worried because she targeted James in the competition, and that it would expose the plan to get him out. We do see James ranting about Yvette taking him out before Janelle, who she supposedly hates. Actually, not supposedly, she does hate. Also, the house is told that one of the first 4 evictees will be coming back in the house, and like in BB3, the person who is evicted in this week doesn't have a chance to come back. I don't get why they did that here and in BB3. It's just very weird. So the friendship wants Eric back, and the Sovs want Kaser back, and Janelle mentions Michael too. The Sovs talk about how Maggie needs to go this week since she and Eric getting back together again will be a problem, and James suggests for Maggie and April to be nominated, but Howie has other plans. Rachel, Janelle, and Howie talk about targeting James, and Janelle thinks that they need to get rid of Maggie. Rachel is fine with James going, but he needs to be backdoored, and they don't want to alienate Sarah, especially if James stays. Both women mention that they are better off with Maggie gone, and they potentially have 6 again if Kaser returns. April and Jennifer mentions that they don't trust James and Sarah since he swore on the Bible the house will be less divided with him gone, and how they should talk everyone in the house. Yvette and Beau enters and mentions that James is heartless and that if he nominates James and Sarah this week, they will handle the other one next week, which he agrees to. James and Sarah enters the room, and Howie tells them that they were told that he's on Beau and Maggie's side, and that he was targeting them. James mentions that it would make no sense for him to do so, and that they shouldn't second-guess one another, especially with Eric coming back. Rachel mentions in the diary room that she's never liked James, but he isn't as big of a concern as Maggie. Maggie ends up speaking to Howie alone in the bathroom, and they both talk about James, where he will win if the two sides don't get together to get him out. She tells him that she can make him safe with Eric if he comes back next week, and Howie gives her his word that he's nominating James and Sarah. We have a scene of April having a tail since a bone broke off when she fell off a horse, which is funny. Howie tells Rachel in bed that he, and apparently Janelle, which we didn't see, made deals with the entire house about James and Sarah going up, and Rachel is pissed off that they blabbed their mouths, since it was supposed to stay between them, and the most ideal thing was to backdoor him, which they can't even do now with this returnee twist. We have a segment of April claiming to not smoking cigarettes in her regular life, and she started smoking in the house, but mainly smokes more than she does, and runs out of cigarettes, to the point where she's begging the diary room to get more, and it's a pretty funny moment. Maggie and April speak about how they want James out, and they realize that Maggie effed up last week by not putting up James and Sarah last week. We learn that Rachel told Maggie about how she feels about James. Maggie mentions that Rachel never spoke to her again after the first week. Howie ends up nominating James and Sarah for eviction. James and Sarah are genuinely shocked that they are nominated, and quickly becomes angry, where Harry at the moment doesn't have any regrets. Sarah tells James to not speak to Howie and Rachel, but he's insistent, and ends up arguing with Maggie and April, since they claim he lacks accountability, especially since he swore on the Bible. Howie calls them out about not being loyal, since James suggested to throw him and Rachel on the block, but they mention that it would never actually happen. James denies it as an immediate reaction, but they would never do it. Rachel and Janelle join the HOH room, and they mention that Howie and Rachel will be the biggest targets after this, where Janelle mentions that he swore on the Bible, which James starts to twist. Sarah asks James if he did swear on the Bible, and he admits it, which pisses her off, since she told him to stop doing that crap. He mentions that the friendship conveniently left out that he nullified the deal soon after it, which is true. Sarah then speaks to April about what she specifically did, and the latter mentions that James had Sarah do his dirty work, and mentions that Kaser said that he knows James is a dirty player, and that they did this to themselves. They have another confrontation with Janelle, where she mentions that she doesn't think they're after her, but the friendship came up with a convincing story. Sarah mentions that of course they did, as they came up with a convenient story all last week in the HOH room, and she mentions that they did the same thing to Michael a few weeks ago as well. She accuses them of using herself and James completely. Janelle speaks to Howie that they came up with the story the day Sarah ended up winning the veto, but she doesn't trust the friendship at all. James ended up winning the veto, and it's the same competition that Jace won last season, where the target always gets the most coins, but people never give them too many coins/candy pieces, so they never go over. The house is discussing about who to put up as a pawn, and the entire house is working together not only about who to put up, but because they all want James out next week, where they will get Sarah out this week. We start to see tension with April and Yvette, where the former initially volunteered herself, but is now pushing for Yvette to go up, since she's tired of hearing James's mouth and knows that he will campaign against her. Yvette has no problem going up, but doesn't like how April is approaching it. April and Yvette start going at it once again in front of the entire house, and Yvette repeats what April said in their earlier conversation, as April claims that Yvette never listens and doesn't stop talking. Maggie and April see Yvette and James talking, and it makes them even more distrustful of her, and April throws Yvette under the bus to the Souths, where she states that Yvette and James are working together. Jennifer and April throw Yvette under the bus even more and mentions that Sarah isn't a threat. James vetoes himself, and Howie nominates Yvette as the replacement nominee. Yvette is sketched out by April and Jennifer, which she has every right to be, since apparently Jennifer and April really were campaigning really hard to boot Yvette to the Souths, and that the vote should be 6-1, but if the Souths flip, it would be 4-3, and she knows that the former two are sketchy as hell. Yvette tells Beau that she doesn't trust April or Jennifer and flips April off after they walk off. April speaks to the Souths about Yvette having something with James and that Yvette hasn't spoken to her all day. Or in a day, actually. Jennifer campaigned against Yvette to Maggie, who really doesn't like this, so she speaks to Yvette, who tells Maggie that she doesn't appreciate that April and Jennifer immediately ran to hang out with the Souths, and it would make sense for them to boot her now, and then they gain an extra 2 weeks booting James and Sarah afterwards. Maggie then speaks to Jennifer and Yvette about the agreement that the group of 8 made to vote out Sarah, and notes that they are silent, and their silence says a lot to Maggie. None of this ends up mattering, as Sarah is evicted in a 6-1 vote. Sarah really isn't notable in this season, and while she isn't forgettable, she doesn't really do a whole lot. As a player, she didn't make much mistakes, wasn't really a good one either, and it's very clear that she wouldn't be cast on most seasons and was just a last-minute replacement. In general, she's very nice, and she did start having a bit of sass in her last week, so that was kind of fun. Overall, not too much there as a player or a personality, but it's fine and likable enough. Week 6 is not only the most iconic week in the season, but one of the most iconic weeks in Big Brother history, and it's just so great watching everything that happens. Whether you are very angry at the result or you really like seeing cutthroat moves taking place, it's really something that you won't forget. And it has the best of Big Brother in this week. Yvette is shocked that the votes were 6-1 to keep her, and people ended up keeping their words, where James thinks that they wanted to break him down on a personal level. James and Yvette have a conversation about their friendship, and Kesa ends up returning to the house, where 3 people are happy, James doesn't care, and the other half of the house is annoyed. We have the longest endurance competition ever, beating Big Brother 5's Button HOH competition, which ran for 9 hours, and I believe this competition ran for like 14 hours. And there's a lot of random filler scenes while the competition is taking place. Beau gets drunk during the competition. April gets people to promise her safety so she could be let go, and she didn't watch the HOH, but Maggie was annoyed. James randomly lets go of the button because Yvette breaking down got to him, since she wanted it for her family, and Rachel gave him some evil face. Jennifer fake cries so Kesa and Rachel, the only 2 people left in the comp, can drop, where Rachel accidentally lets go, and Jennifer makes a self-fulfilling prophecy about not caring if she left next week. Maggie and the others explains about how the other 8, everyone but James and Sarah, met in the HOH room to make this agreement to get James out after Sarah. Kesa lets go, so 2 people on her side can go up, and James will be backdoored. It's ridiculous that he made the offer of her having to put up 2 people from her side, since that isn't incentive at all. That's not a good incentive for her, and it makes it less appealing for Jennifer, but that's just how Kesa sees things. Janelle, Kesa, and Howie talk in the workout room, where he tells them the deal, and he's hoping that the worst case scenario is she will put up 1 person on one side and 1 person on the other side. Jennifer explains the deal to April, and she doesn't like that they have to use their people as pawns, especially when the Souths last week were trying to campaign to get Yvette out last week, and while she trusts Kesa, she doesn't trust his allies and how they will vote. Jennifer nominates Rachel and Janelle for eviction, which pisses off the Souths since it was not in the agreement to nominate people from that side. The Souths do not take the nominations well, since Jennifer's credibility was shot. James knows that he will get backdoored and outright mentions it to them. Howie is trying to get his allies to calm down, but they mention that he isn't the one who's on the block, but they all know that there's a chance that the noms will stay the same. James is annoyed that Kesa came up with the plan and doesn't really blame Jennifer, where we also have Yvette giving him a pep talk about how he has several days to save himself. James speaks to Jennifer about her verbalizing that she's Kaysar what he wanted and mentions Yvette's crying had him realize that he was playing for revenge, where he throws the Sophs under the bus. The friendship mentions how James is complaining about how the back door not fair, but they mention that he's had a month beforehand to not be in this position. Jennifer speaks to Kaysar about his disappointment with the nominations since she told him that she would nominate Maggie, but she mentions that she didn't do it because he was not in the house last week, especially with the Sophs really pushing for Yvette to go, so she can't trust them with how they vote. Kaysar mentions that she conveniently didn't mention this when they were in the HOH comp, and didn't mention that she changed her mind, but she didn't want to be swayed, or at least that's what she's claiming. Yvette tells her allies that James has had a change of heart and defends him, where she mentions that in 2 seconds they broke the plan and worked with James once again with the vote. But the Friendship Alliance aren't buying it, but some of them, mainly Yvette and April, are talking about how it is a numbers game. Rachel ends up winning the veto, and everyone is lining up, or everything is lining up for James to get backdoored, where he is just complaining about it. Both suggest for them to get rid of Kaysar, and Yvette pushes it as well, where April also likes the idea. Maggie is about keeping her word, but she changes her mind since no one else is playing like that as well, and they mention that they're pissed off that Eric wasn't brought back. Kaysar and Howie decide to not doubt the other side, while Rachel wouldn't be shocked if they don't put up James, though she thinks it would be Howie who would be the replacement now. Jennifer speaks to all of her allies individually, where Maggie, Yvette, and April mentions to get rid of Kaysar, since there's no chance he doesn't put them up. Yvette apparently wanted him out on the first week, a bad vibe, and April mentions that is really pissed off at Jennifer and is the leader of the group. Moe mentions that he would get rid of James since he is a better competitor. Maggie is questioned by Kaysar about whether Janelle is going to follow the deal, and she mentions that Jennifer is still following through, though Jennifer hasn't told anyone about what she will do. And he asks Jennifer, and she of course lies to him, but in the diary room that he should have held on in the competition if he wanted the plan to go through. Rachel takes herself off the block, and Kaysar is named as the replacement nominee. James is literally stunned, since he was literally getting up to move in the nominee seat before the name was mentioned, and he literally froze. The Sophs are all really pissed off at the friendship, especially Jennifer. Kaysar confronts her about breaking every condition of the deal, and Jennifer is extremely nonchalant about it, where she mentions that he probably thinks that this was all pre-planned, even if it wasn't. He rants about how he handed her the HOH, where he and Janelle mentions that she cries on cue, where Jennifer knows that they aren't going to believe anything she says at this point. Kaysar asks April about what's happened, with the other Sophs being present, and she mentions that it was a group decision, where Howie decides to rip into April about her not having a chance to win, and how she can't win competitions. Janelle mentions that Howie isn't a liar unlike her, and April mentions that she has lied, she being Janelle, where Janelle claims that she's never lied. Howie calls her husband ugly and insults her dog, which causes April to cry about what was said. Janelle also decides to attack the friendship, but no one takes the bait. April calls Janelle a drunk, and they go back and forth about April being a gold digger, and Janelle being a slut. Janelle calls Beau a whore, and he makes fun of her polyester hair, where things get borderline physical, where Yvette has to pull him aside and tells the Alliance that they need to calm down and to stick together, hoping that the other side will be too rattled to win HOH. Howie continues his attacks about April's dog, and she makes fun of his disabled finger. Kaysar is evicted in a unanimous 7-0 vote. While it sucks what happened to Kaysar when he returned, he honestly brought it upon himself. He was already evicted, so it shows to him that he was already expendable to the house, so he should have held on if he wanted to regain power in the house. And with the way he approached the deal, he wanted her to sacrifice her people when that wasn't an incentivizing deal for her or anyone on that side. In general, this return week is why I have him lower as a player, but we will talk about that when I rank the cast as game players. Week 7 definitely does have its good moments, but it's definitely calmer compared to the last 2 weeks especially. So Janelle wins HOH and immediately flips off the Alliance, with Howie obnoxiously celebrating as well. Jennifer throws the key to the side after Janelle tells her to "Give me the key, bitch!" and to pack her bags, so she doesn't give it to Janelle. Julie tells her that she has a few minutes to nominate people, and she quickly nominates Jennifer and Maggie, before saying bye-bye bitches to them as she's carried off by Howie. Jennifer is aware that she sacrificed herself for the team, and Howie continues to go after April, who doesn't really care, and mentions that Rachel gave him the HOH, while they're complaining about how Kaysar gave Jennifer the HOH. Rachel tells him to calm down, since they have another competition in a day or two. Rachel is hoping that they can tell James that they will help him get Maggie out, but they want Maggie out, and he's planning on putting both sides against one another. Or pitting them against one another, I should say. James is the only one not in an alliance to see Janelle's HOH room, or he's the one who is not in the alliance to see it, and Yvette is still hoping that James has her back, where he mentions that it would be a blessing in disguise if Maggie goes, and that they will go after Jennifer after that. April and Jennifer plot behind the couches and mentions that Yvette is in it for herself and is campaigning against, and her being Jennifer and campaigning for Maggie. She is spending more time with James, and April wants to vote out Yvette, and they both realize that it is just the two of them fighting for one another. Janelle ends up winning the veto, and James mentions that Yvette agrees that this is personal against Jennifer. Janelle outright admits it, and James mentions that Maggie is the one who needs to go. Since she sees through him, he doesn't mention that part to them, but because she keeps the alliance together. He mentions that if she puts Yvette up, she has his and Beau's vote. Janelle vetoes Maggie and mentions that she votes to evict before correcting herself and saying nominating Yvette. Of course, Yvette doesn't like the nomination speech, and she feels eerie since it's all personal, and she knows that there was a push to get her out the last time she was on the block. Jennifer knows that it's clear that Janelle did this so James and Beau can vote her out, and Yvette thinks Beau would have been a better pawn. Jennifer is evicted in a 5-1 vote. So like I mentioned in Big Brother 5, they started really under-editing certain house guests, and they continued that in this season, where Jennifer was one of the house guests who was severely under-edited before her HOH week, and we really don't get a feeling about who she is as a person or as a player. And she definitely blew her game when she won HOH, since she was under the radar up until this point, and it seemed like she and April had the quote-unquote better relationships with the Softs compared to the others. So yeah, she kind of just blew it here. And her chaotic HOH definitely made things memorable, but I don't know if she herself is very memorable on her own. Beau ends up winning HOH, which causes the friendship to cheer, and the other side is upset, especially since it's clear that because Howie and Rachel are a pair and there's only 3 of them, that they are going to be split up. Beau immediately tells his allies that Rachel and Howie are going up, but Maggie also reminds them about James. Rachel tells Howie that they made a lot of critical error, and it goes back to his HOH, where he let Maggie railroad them. For some reason, we are forced to see the shrine that the friendship has made in Beau's HOH room, which includes plates of Eric and Jennifer. Howie and April somewhat make amends after his attacks on her last week, but he doesn't really mean his apology, and she doesn't really accept it, since he just lost $5,000 with his behavior, meaning he can't win a jury vote. Beau tells his allies that he wants the order to be Rachel, then Janelle, then Howie, but Maggie reminds them that James needs to go sooner than later, and April knows that she can beat Howie and Janelle at the end, but James isn't sure because he has played the game. Beau nominates Howie and Rachel for eviction, calling her gray, as well as pitch black and stark white. Rachel really doesn't like the speech, and she gives him these faces and calls him Bobo, and Yvette really doesn't like Rachel's reaction to being nominated, and she goes off in person, or at least to the others that isn't Rachel, and in that diary room about how Rachel is an old hag, makes a horse face, and is a sore loser. Rachel is being very sarcastic about the speech, and the others talk about her being nasty, where they all saw her as Two-Face beforehand, but she's even more so now, is a biatch, and is a competitor. Everyone knows that James is playing both sides and is telling the Softs that he wants to tell April right as he hugs her that if he wins HOH that she's going up in her ear. So that's who he's planning on targeting and nominating, April and Maggie. James ends up winning the veto, and it's clear that he's not going to use it. We get a segment about how James is the veto king, which is the record he's held for several years, only to recently lose it due to the recent seasons. Rachel wants to be evicted over Howie, since it was his dream to be on here, and she thinks it's the smarter move for them anyways. Also mentioning James has a deal with Beau and Yvette. Unsurprisingly, James does not use the veto. Both nominees mention that they think they're going to leave, since Howie made things personal and Rachel is a better player. Beau wants Howie to streak naked, and he wants Beau, Yvette, and Mikey to swear on the Bible that they will vote to keep him, but they don't do it so he doesn't streak. Maggie doesn't get why their allies are so focused on pairs instead of the biggest threat, meaning James. Where even April mentions that with Maggie that James has to play with the Softs since he can't beat anyone in the friendship in the jury vote, but he can beat the Softs. We get a segment about how James has made it so far in the season, where the others talk about how he's one of the most dominant players in Big Brother history, as he's won 5 vetoes essentially. James mentions that he has to compete in veto competitions, and he pits both sides against one another, so he treasures each side to the other. He also mentions that if he wins HOH, Maggie and April are going up, but he makes the final 2 with Janelle, since he knows that he will beat her at the end. Rachel is evicted in a unanimous 5-0 vote. Rachel is one of the more straight, level-headed characters and house guests in the season, and I think she fulfilled that role very well, as she is very likable, but she definitely had her funny and bitchier sides to her. While I don't think she's great strategically or even good, I do think she's a solid player all around, but I do think that she isn't as memorable as some of the others. Despite that, she's definitely one of the more likable people on the season, even if she isn't one of the more interesting ones. I think week 8 is definitely an enjoyable week, and we have the second fully executed backdoor in Big Brother ever, and it's just as dramatic as the first one. Actually, no, that's a lie. It's definitely well deserved here, and it's interesting to see how it played out. And we have a week of kind of peace between the two sides, though we have several meltdowns, which are just very entertaining to watch as well. So April ends up winning HOH, and Janelle makes a mention that Maggie was HOH twice, since she railroaded Howie's HOH, and Maggie does not like this perception. April and Maggie immediately approach Howie and Janelle to tell them that they're backdooring James, so they cannot pick him in the POV, since this is the last week to backdoor someone, and I love how they are aware that the final 7 is the last time they can backdoor someone, since that definition gets thwarted so much after this season, where they think they can backdoor people from final 6 onwards. Anyways, they, including Beau, doesn't like that Yvette is hanging out with James so much, since it's clear that he's going to use Yvette as an angle to stay. Yvette pushes for Janelle to go, since she knows more about the game than anyone else, and Beau mentions that it's either going to be Janelle or James going this week. April mentions that Yvette is the only person safe with James, and he's playing everyone in the house. Howie and Janelle are not sure about believing them, since James was supposed to be backdoored a few weeks ago. Janelle wants Yvette beside her, because the veto will be used, at least, for sure, and she doesn't want herself and Howie to be nominated, and Yvette wins veto where she wouldn't use it if she is not nominated, just so James can stay and she could get rid of her. April mentions that if Yvette does that, everyone will go after her next week, and Yvette better tell her ahead of time if she wants to use the veto. April nominates Janelle and Howie for eviction. James asks April about picking him for the veto competition, and she tells him that she is picking Maggie, since she's her somewhat partner, which alerts James. James knows that he is getting backdoored, and April mentions to Yvette that James is getting after her and Maggie. Yvette ends up agreeing that she would use the veto if she wanted, but she's aware that if she was solely thinking about herself, she would take James to the end, and Maggie mentions to Yvette that her working for James is seen as going against the friendship. James was not chosen for the veto competition, and he has to host the competition that will seal his fate, no matter who wins it. April ends up winning the veto, and Janelle ends up winning America's Choice, which is a phone call to the person of her own choice, which is Michael. The friendship are jealous that Janelle wins all the prizes, and we have Yvette storm to her HOH room, where she has a huge meltdown, especially since she's the only person who has never heard anything from home. The friendship thinks it's ridiculous that Janelle wanted to speak to Michael, someone she hooked up with for 2 weeks instead of speaking to her mother, which honestly I agree with. That her conversation with Michael was extremely shallow, and they hate that America loves Janelle. Of course, Yvette wants her gone, and she hates her so much. Ultimately, April calls the fans that watch the show pieces of shit, which she's not really lying about a lot of the fans, to be honest. They would have been fine if she spoke to her mother, but they all have families, and of course James enters the HOH room to cheer them up. It's very entertaining to watch this meltdown. April tells Janelle that she has a target on her back, and winning all these prizes isn't helping her. They try to use this so they can build suspense, but April still vetoes Janelle from the block, smart choice because they would be tempted to vote Janelle out, and replaces her with James as the nominee. James is shocked that Howie was left on the block instead of Janelle, and he realizes that he doesn't have a chance, since if it was Janelle who was still on the block, he would at least have somewhat of a chance. Maggie doesn't like that Yvette is cheering James up, and he doesn't get why Yvette is so loyal to the friendship. James goes to campaign to Yvette, and he hopes that she can convince people to vote Howie out, where they can all go after Janelle next week. Maggie is tired of repeating the same thing with Yvette, so when she campaigns to her for James, Maggie tells Yvette that he has 3 days, but it's clear that she isn't interested in hearing any pitch from him or about him. James and Howie start to blatantly campaign against one another, in front of one another, with the entire house present, and it's kind of funny as they're doing it somewhat jokingly, though there's clearly some truth to what each of them are saying. James campaigns to Janelle about how they will be a stronger duo together than her and Howie. He tells Yvette that Janelle made a pinky vote to keep him, which is a lie, and he mentions that if she and Bo vote for him to stay, he will stay. James is evicted on a unanimous 4-0 vote. James was definitely enjoyable in this season, and I like how he was one of the more, I don't want to say level-headed, but he was one of the more blunt people in the house, and was kind of the Greek chorus to all the bullcrap between both sides. But he definitely put himself in the sticky position with blatantly trying to play both sides very early on in the season, and he always tried to twist and lie his way out of everything. But in general, I did like his diary rooms. I found him to be a fun, entertaining presence on the season, and I think the season would be a lot worse without him on it, so yeah. Week 9 is definitely a tame and rather boring week, but honestly, it's the end game at this point, so it's kind of expected, and at least they sped up the end game instead of dragging it out for like 5 weeks like they did in Big Brother 4. So Howie ends up winning the HOH, and it's another double eviction. And Yvette whines about not getting HOH again, since she's the only person that hasn't won it in the house. And she's so mad that they didn't get rid of Janelle, since she has the worst soul. He nominates Bo and Yvette for eviction, as it's another double eviction, where no one is shocked because they are the final pair in the house. Which is probably why Bo shouldn't have targeted Rachel and Howie on his HOH. And he kind of mentioned this, but yeah, an oversight on Bo's part. Anyways, Janelle mentions that Bo is the target because he's the most physical player, or he's more physical compared to Yvette. We will see the house play with lightsabers that Howie got on his HOH, and we will see them play with it the entire week. April and Maggie mention that they are going to have to pair up as a couple, since Bo and Yvette are going to fight for one another, though Yvette will deny it. Yvette asks Maggie to play the veto for her, and is hoping that Maggie would take her off the block, and April would be the renom, where they vote April out, but Maggie doesn't want to be in this position. Holly ends up hosting the veto competition, and it's interesting that they chose her, a third boot who wasn't a big presence in Big Brother 5, but it just showed how much they liked her. Anyways. And also, Renee isn't the first person who says bootay, since Holly ends up saying it during this competition about 18 years earlier. Anyways, Maggie ends up winning the veto and doesn't like that she has to choose between 3 of her allies, essentially, but she wanted to be safe, so she went after the win. Maggie speaks to Howie, and she's annoyed that he immediately brought Janelle into the HOH room, but Janelle doesn't want to leave them alone, since the last time they talked on their own, Howie made a stupid move on his last HOH. Maggie talks to her allies about how Howie doesn't deserve to win if he can't have conversations without Janelle. Then he doesn't deserve to win over her. She tells them that even if she uses the veto, one of Yvette or Bo is still going home, and then when it's just April and Maggie, the latter tells April that she might use the veto. April ends up crying to Janelle that she might go up, and Janelle tells her that Maggie might use the veto to send her home, and to keep the pair together. And we also see April cry her eyes out to Maggie, where they have another conversation where she mentions that it would be a better move to keep the pair together. That's what Maggie is telling April, and that she can't beat any of the others in the friendship in a jury vote. And Maggie might actually be right about this, since it was very close in the final vote with her against Yvette, and who knows how it would have been with April and Bo. And I think they liked Yvette and Bo over Maggie, meaning the Souths liked those two over Maggie. Anyways, April's crying because she saved Maggie, since James was the one who was targeting Maggie, and she mentioned that she did it more for Maggie and deserved to be in the house over Yvette, and their mutual dislike for one another comes up again. Maggie mentions that she will keep April, but she shouldn't strategically, so Maggie doesn't end up using the veto. Bo is evicted in a 3-0 unanimous vote. Bo is the main person outside of Jennifer who suffered from the imbalanced edit and being severely under-edited, as we didn't hear much about his game or much about him in general, outside of flirting with Howie, kind of being the fun presence, and the easier presence compared to some of the others in the friendship, but we just didn't get much from him overall. I think as a player, he is pretty solid or mediocre from the little we've seen, and he definitely had the better social game and was fine enough, and he wasn't as vile or annoying as most of the others in the friendship, so he seems like a pretty cool person in general. But as a character and a house guest and a strategist, very middle of the road. We learn here that Janelle wanted Yvette gone in the vote since she's annoying, but Howie wanted Bo gone, so that's where they went. Yvette is taking the loss of Bo really poorly, but she ends up winning HOH, though Maggie blatantly threw it to her, which Yvette is kind of aware of, and she has a very obnoxiously joyous celebration. Yvette mentions that she promised both Eric and Bo that she will take Janelle out of the house, and it's what she's wanted since week 1, where of course Howie and Janelle are pissed off about the results. We get to the shrine in the HOH room again, where they place Eric, Jennifer, and now Bo's plates and the pictures of their families in the room as well. Janelle plans that the best case scenario is for her to win the veto, Yvette nominates April, and they approach Yvette with a final 3 deal, where she breaks the tie to evict April, and they will target Mikey at the final 4. And this is actually a good strategic thought of Janelle, but it doesn't incentivize Yvette since it's clear that Yvette would just be 3rd. They know that Yvette doesn't like April, and she can't pass this opportunity up. We got a segment of Howie and Janelle playing the lightsabers, and it's clear that because it's the endgame and the split is so strong and definitive, there's nothing really happening in the house by this point. Yvette ends up nominating Janelle and Howie for eviction, where it's clear that Janelle is the target, though Yvette is aware that if she kept them in the house, she would win the season over each of them at the end of a jury vote. Janelle did not like Yvette's nomination speech, where she mentioned that Janelle manipulated several of the men in the house during the season, and Yvette should have just admitted that Janelle is good. Janelle ends up pulling a clutch veto win, and Yvette is really annoyed that her mission was thwarted, since she knows that Janelle will take her out, but she starts laughing about it afterwards. Yvette starts laughing. April knows that she's going to be nominated, and it will come down to a tiebreaker vote, and the Souths are sad since they know that Howie is most likely a goner, but they are going to propose Yvette with a deal still, though Yvette approaches Howie with this conversation. Janelle takes herself off the block, and Yvette nominates April as the replacement nominee. The Souths know that the only person that they need to convince is Yvette, since she's the tiebreaker vote, and they know that Yvette cannot beat April or Mikey at the end. April and Yvette see on the TV that the Souths are kissing Yvette's ass, and even April mentions that she and Yvette clash all the time. The Souths mention that if April and Mikey are her true friends, they will not be mad that she did the best move for herself to win, which is taking the two of them to the end. April doesn't like that they're bringing up people's financial situation in it and their status, since she has credit card bills that she needs to pay as well, and it's annoying Yvette since April always mentioned that she doesn't care about the money, but now her mind is changing. Once Yvette walks off, Yvette tells Maggie that she would feel like crap if April won the season. Howie is evicted in a 2-1 vote, with Yvette breaking the tie. There are several moments in the season where Howie is somewhat likable and really funny, but there are other moments in the season where Howie is just very vile, very creepy, and crosses the boundaries way too much and would be awkward if he was on a more recent season. As a player, I thought he had some potential since he was kind of in the middle and had good relationships with everyone, but he kind of threw that away, and the more we saw of him strategically, the worse and worse it became that he was as a player, especially on a strategic level. In general, I think Howie was okay. I honestly think week 10 is a very good week, and it's definitely one of the stronger endgame weeks in Big Brother history. Of course, we had the unexpected result where the majority has to turn on one another, and the conflict that has been simmering for weeks finally blows up in a very good series of arguments, and it gives us some great late game drama, especially with the last few weeks definitely lacking drama in comparison. And of course, we had our meltdowns too. So Janelle ends up winning HOH, which means that the friendship has no choice but to turn on one another, and they're pissed off. Janelle is hoping that her nominations will cause distrust with them, and Maggie doesn't want it to get ugly. April tells Maggie that Janelle doesn't want to bring Yvette, so she's hoping that they can get Yvette out. Janelle invites them to sleep in the HOH room with her, and they of course reject, as they mention that it's a little too late in their eyes. Yvette and Janelle start to somewhat bond about how they both want to have children, and then the friendship talks about how what they did was monumental, not really, and that they'll all be friends, which we know won't be the case with some of these people. But Janelle interrupts their conversation, and she mentions that it is all strategic. Some of them see that there's a human side to Janelle, but are confused about how she can be so nice, but chooses to be very mean as well. But they think she is just trying to butter them up for jury votes. There is an America's prize to watch them film 2.5 Men, and of course Janelle wins it. The other three do a joint diary room, where they realize that they are hated by America, and then they rant outside about it. Yvette mentions that America should love a nurse who dated a firefighter for 7 years, and America should love a Texan woman like April, and they mention that America should love the spicy Latina who has done unselfish things like potting herself, and how they all talk about their family. It's mainly Yvette mentioning things, but April mentions that none of that is the game, so the public wouldn't care about that. They are confused since Janelle is a cocktail waitress who only talks about the amount of money a guy has. Yvette rants about how Janelle hated her since day 2, so of course Yvette hates her back, and April mentions that she never stated she hates someone, though we get a compilation flashback of her stating such, and Yvette mentions that Janelle might have done well with hiding behind stronger players, winning competitions, and manipulating men, but she has no soul. It's just a huge, epic meltdown of epic proportions. Despite all of that, we see April start to somewhat bond with Janelle about girly stuff, and they bond about plastic surgery stuff. Maggie is not into any of that. April talks to Janelle upstairs in the HRH room, and they both agree that Yvette needs to go. Maggie and Yvette talk, and Yvette knows that they are talking to make a deal, which is what Janelle wanted, and they're talking about knocking her off, where April has been up there for about 40 to 45 minutes. Most of them mention that April is loose with information, and Mikey is proud to never make a deal with anyone on the other side, and so is Yvette. April denies that they talked about nominations and who they want to knock off, but Yvette doesn't believe it. Mikey mentions that Janelle must feel comfortable that she approached April enough to speak to her, and not Maggie or Yvette. And I think that's because April's the better social player out of the three. Janelle nominates Yvette and Mikey for eviction. No one is shocked with the nominations, and Yvette knows that she is the target. She talks about how April changed the way she played the game, where April didn't care about the money at first, but now that changed, and mentions that April is a good manipulator. Maggie decides to play the middle between the two women, and April mentions to Maggie that she is safe, so she should throw the veto. Maggie tells Yvette this, and this pisses Yvette off, since it means it's two, the two being Janelle and April, against one, which is Yvette, since Maggie isn't fighting for it. Yvette ends up winning the veto, and she's extremely excited that she saved her butt, causing her to cheer very loudly. April didn't like how Yvette celebrated, since she felt like Yvette was rubbing it in their faces and didn't consider that it meant that one of her friends would be going home. April tells Yvette how hurt her feelings were in the gym, and Yvette clarified that it just came out because when your butt's on the line and you save yourself, it's just a really great feeling. April thinks that it shouldn't matter, and you should win with grace, especially since they are all in the same predicament. After Yvette leaves the room, April cries that her feelings were not validated and that she is going home. April ends up crying to Janelle in the HOA room, and Janelle's buttering April up for her jury vote, and April admits that she didn't give Janelle the benefit of the doubt. April is tired of Yvette mentioning her financial situation over and over again. She ends up speaking to Yvette again and mentions that she didn't act like that when she won her competitions, and Yvette brings up that when she told Maggie to not fight for the veto, and when Yvette was told that, it hurt her feelings. Yvette ends up using the veto on herself, and April is forced to be the replacement nominee. The friendship ends up going in the backyard, and they have a conversation where April tells them that when you're leaving, you start to reflect about everything that was done and what you're ashamed of. But April mentions that she wouldn't have acted and done many of the things she did in the house if she wasn't influenced by Yvette. Of course, Yvette is shocked and hurt by this, especially since she was the one that supposedly had the bigger blame. At least that's what April's trying to push, instead of the other members of the friendship, or the friendship collectively. Maggie tries to calm the situation down, and Yvette is yelling, since April is a 31-year-old woman who can make her own choices. Apparently, during this conversation, from a clip I saw on YouTube, I don't know if it's still up there, that they brought up the Michael situation during here as well, but of course that didn't make it on the edit. April is annoyed because Yvette is always right, never listens to her, and she can never get a word in. Yvette mentions that if April won the veto, she wouldn't be acting like this and there would be no epiphany. April mentions that for the last several weeks, she has not enjoyed where she was in the group, and they mention that they haven't enjoyed hanging out with one another for the last few weeks. Yvette thinks April was pretending to like her, and she tells her to shove the Vito up her ass, declaring that they won't be friends outside of the house, which Yvette has lived up to, definitely. Yvette votes to evict April out of the house. I actually think April is a very underrated player. While there are definitely two sides of the house that she played into it, I definitely think she had the best relationships with the soft side of the house, and she always approached them with ideas and tried to keep the line of communication open. And I really liked how she used her HOH. As a character, I found her to be very funny, as her delusions was something the editors always poked at, where she acted like she didn't trash people, but we would see her trashing people, and just her weird mannerisms were just great to watch. Overall, she definitely contributed to a lot of the hilarity and dramatic moments of this season. Week 11 is definitely a grim week in comparison, but it's the final week, and it's mainly grim due to the results of the season. Anyways, Janelle blows it on part 1, where Yvette and Maggie talk about who should win it, since Yvette thinks that Janelle will take Maggie to the final 2, which is inaccurate, and it seems like Maggie wanted to win this one. Yvette ends up winning part 1 with a final HOH, and she isn't excited about it. Janelle does end up winning part 2 of the final HOH, and Maggie is no longer in the running. Janelle has a conversation with Yvette that she would win if Maggie was booted, and Yvette admits that she is in the bind, but Janelle says that Yvette doesn't even have to do anything in a final HOH. And she tells Yvette that she's taking her to the end. None of this ends up mattering since Yvette wins the final HOH and chooses to evict Janelle, though she and Yvette talk about how they are hoping that they get to play All-Stars together, which almost happened. So, as I was watching the season, I forgot how absolutely poor Janelle's social game was throughout the entire season. And as a player, she definitely had her moments of decent strategic reads and mindset, and there are other moments where she just played super personally. Despite some off comments that haven't aged well, Janelle was a joy to watch, and she's definitely a huge standout in this season, and it's no shocker that she became the favorite. James asks Maggie about her definitive moment in the season that got her to the end, and she responds that she is there because of all of her team members and not a specific moment, and she wanted to play a linear game the entire season. Rachel asks Yvette why she shouldn't vote for Maggie, and Yvette says that she can't give her a reason to not vote for Maggie. Howie asks Yvette if she played with integrity, and she states that she didn't lie and played with integrity, where she was too honest at times. Janelle asks Yvette about how she was playing with her family in mind, but her choice last night was a $450,000 mistake, so why did she do it? And Yvette mentions that she would have thrown it automatically if she took her to the final 2, due to the promise that the friendship made. Janelle asks Maggie why should she vote for her when she didn't make many plays in the game, and Maggie responds that she was competitive, but she didn't need to be in the spotlight, but she was a strategic and strong player. Bo asks Maggie what her strategy was when Eric left the house, and she responds that her strategy was to not get evicted, as she thought that she would be evicted many times and right after Eric left, but she made the friendships and the bonds afterwards, where she was able to be herself. April asks Yvette if she threw the competitions before the final 5 when she started winning, and Yvette responds that she knew that the other side wanted her gone since week 2, so she did not throw any of those competitions. Jennifer asks Maggie about who was the one person who mentioned Kesa when she was HOH, and Maggie mentions that she doesn't know, though Yvette mentions that it was her, and claims it was herself and Bo. Maggie's final speech is about how much of a player she was, and her strategic moves were about not being the aggressor or the person who shines, but to blend in while maintaining her competitive edge, learning to lose in some comps and letting others playing a bigger role, but she gave 100% of herself in the game. Yvette's final speech is about how she deserves the money because she played it being herself, and she's proud of it, but she knows that there were casualties that got her to where she is. She volunteered herself several times for the team, but she's grateful to make it to the end. Maggie ends up winning the season in a 4-3 vote. Yvette was definitely a frustrating player in the season, not only just due to her vile comments, but the way she played the game so personally and saw things so simplistically at times was just ridiculous. But I was entertained by her many meltdowns, and she definitely did have some vulnerable moments in the season, so she brought a lot to the season, for good and for bad, and is a polarizing at best house guest. As a player, honestly, I kind of saw her worse during this rewatch than I did beforehand, where she was really in a tight bond in the beginning of the season, and it seems like she was only in the position that she was in due to the twist. At the same time, props to her for micromanaging her alliance, where a lot of them didn't like each other and were a lot more reckless in comparison. As a character, Maggie was definitely a bore and didn't offer much at all, but she was here to play the game and she went back to her business, so I guess I can't be mad at her about that. When it comes to strategy, the season is easily the weakest out of all the others so far, even over Big Brother 2, which says a lot. Um, but it did give us a different dynamic with there being two sides of the house, and seeing how everyone had to deal with that made it very interesting, and there's always a ping pong effect throughout the season. While it wasn't as strong as Big Brother 4's ping pong effect, the casting was a lot stronger here, so you were a lot more invested. There's definitely a good amount of drama and a good amount of hilarious moments. And I liked the way they modernized the season with the effects and the music and the graphics, so it didn't seem like an 80s or 90s soap opera. In general, I really liked the season, though I don't think it's my absolute favorite in the era. It's definitely a good one, and it's a great start if the older seasons are a bit too retro. So, of course, I'm going to rank the game players and the house guests based on their gameplay, which should be very riveting since I don't think very highly of them in this regard. And then I will discuss All Stars. And then after All Stars, I'm going to rank the men and women of the era based on their gameplay. So that will be exciting to look forward to. Thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with something soon. Bye!